This is Talk It Out, the Women's Agenda podcast. Tune in for your weekly download on the latest news, trends and ideas affecting your career or your business. Here's your host, Angela Priestley.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Talk It Out. It's actually not Angela Priestley hosting today, it's Georgie Dent and I'm back in the chair. I am joined by our publisher, Tala Lambert.
Hello.
How are you?
I am very well. It's becoming a bit of a regular occurrence, this, Georgie.
I know. Angela, better watch out. We're also joined in the studio this afternoon by Catriona Hay, who is the General Manager at B&T. Cat, thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Now, to get started today, there's a couple of topics we're going to go over. We're going to kick off with a discussion about diversity and inclusion in advertising. I think it's probably fair to say that stereotypically it's a very male-dominated profession, and I think I'd love to sort of pick your brain about how you think diversity is working out in the field. And then we're going to have a little discussion of a controversial maiden speech in Parliament that was presented by Fraser Anning. We can go through that.
Put it mildly.
Yes, exactly. And then we're going to have a chat about single-sex schools and whether or not they are a good or a bad thing. But Kat, let's get started. So there was recently quite a big article focusing on diversity in advertising. What was that about?
I think for the article was kind of around how for this year there feels like there's some real momentum in the industry around some progress being made, and specifically they went to speak to quite a lot of the agencies, talk about maternity policies and improvements in different agencies and how they're seeing them. And I think overall that does reflect the industry. I think this year, the Me Too, there's a hashtag Time's Up advertising movement that started in New York that's kind of started over here. I think the time is right this year. There's a lot of momentum around diversity and inclusion being recognised as really important to organisations, including the advertising agencies, who create a lot of advertising that influences culture as well. And when I was at Cannes this year, a lot of the work that's being created is also starting to reflect that diversity. So maybe it's a little too late still. So I think there's a statistic that there was 70% of the Australian public were behind marriage equality before agencies and brands started to kind of jump on that bandwagon. I feel that we're at the point where equality and diversity is kind of now being recognised more widespread. So the brands and agencies are starting to kind of jump on that bandwagon and say, hey, this is now important.
Yeah. So because the numbers of women represented in advertising in senior positions is still fairly small, isn't it?
It is. Media agencies do it slightly better. There's quite a few high-profile female CEOs of media agencies. When it comes to creative, there's still a huge gap. I think it's only around 10% of creative directors in Australia are female. And there's a number of reasons for that. Agencies require a lot of long hours. They're beholden to their brand client. And so it's just become an acceptability that people will work from 7 in the morning till 10 p.m. at night. There is still that kind of, not the boys club, but the drinking culture and the going out and the client entertainment. So there's a number of structural things at play there, and then there's a lack of role models. So there's a lack of really high senior female creative directors for the next generation of people coming through. So yeah, there's a number of things in the industry.
I think it's really interesting what you said about the role of creative in this, because in some fields, you can just look at diversity as a product of what's happening in law firms, and there's not necessarily a big flow-on effect outside of the legal profession. But with advertising, because of the power it has in communicating, they're actually if you have only got a very niche group of people who are sort of projecting through creative, then that's quite. Do you think that's right, Tala? As someone who also is in the media and has worked in media.
I think it's a very specific culture in advertising, and I agree with Kat that there are, very definitive structural issues that exist there. Kat and I actually worked at a big media company prior to our respective roles now, but the culture in that at that time was, that you were expected to put in extra hours to drink with clients and spend time out of work making connections, and your career was really outside of the office a lot of the time. And I think that is a very difficult thing for a lot of women, at least in the society that we know, to kind of contend with. I mean, how do they? So it's really encouraging that there are a lot of media agencies and advertising agencies that are willing to kind of put their money where their mouth is now. They're recognising that there's a problem there, and they're putting funding towards these programs and initiatives internally to make sure that that's, that they are inclusive towards women, and they're trying to bring in, more diverse talent. I think it's that the time is certainly ripe. We've waited way too long, and I think Kat mentioned earlier today in a chat that we had, they're just missing out on a huge wealth of talent there, and that's
the main thing is that a lot of big brands are trying to sell stuff like shampoo, and that is a very broad audience. And if you are only, if you have a team of men or males that are from a certain background or a certain cultural group, then you're missing out on that mass cultural marketing opportunity. And so when I spoke to, earlier this year, we held an event called Changing the Ratio, which is kind of aimed at increasing diversity and inclusion in the industry. And Kirsty Muddle, who's the founder of, one of the founders of Cummins & Partners, has started this initiative with a few other creative directors on the back of this, where they looked at why are we not attracting diverse talent in at the very bottom levels of creative. And they found that people who are out west in Sydney, or from Muslim backgrounds or Asian backgrounds or different cultural and religious backgrounds, their parents were always the kind of acceptable career paths were medicine, law, business, and they didn't think of advertising as even an option. It wasn't something that people could take seriously. So once they did that piece of research, they've done a huge campaign around trying to advertise advertising specifically to those different groups, and they did road shows around universities and used out-of-home assets to try and also tap into the parents of those people. And that's kind of the internship programs, and some of the movement that we see on that stage is really encouraging. And Kirsty was genuinely really excited about some of the work that might come out, because who knows about what insight you might get that you didn't know until you have those people within your agency.
I mean, obviously diversity is so much more than just gender. We know that, but I think, I always, when you were speaking before about shampoo, for example, I remember around Super Bowl, I always read those statistics, and it's something like women, are responsible for 80% of consumer spending in America, and I think it's probably similar here. So it seems mad in a way to not be targeting females, and then obviously one way of effectively targeting females is having some female input into your
and
into the creative.
You see some campaigns coming up now that are so in line with how things are shifting. Even I forget the brand that did it, sorry, but with a shaving ad with the women actually showing hair on their bodies, and
imagine.
Oh my god, like the outrage. But I think even something as small as that shows that there is this change happening. And I am not in the mood to be a Debbie Downer today, so I do think that we're making a lot of progress, and that kudos to the ad agencies that are involved in this initiative and are bringing in greater policies internally and supporting their female workforce and their more diverse workforce. I think it's
Kat, before we move on from advertising, I'm just interested to know the comment that you made before about when you were over in Cannes, and that you're already sort of seeing that some new perspectives are coming out. What did you see there?
So there's a great campaign that you might have seen. It used the hashtag called Share the Load. Have you guys seen that campaign?
Yes,
so this started in India, and it's just a very different ad. It's for Persil, I think, or one of the washing powder brands.
Yes.
And it portrays a woman in India, which is very entrenched gender stereotypes. A woman in India, her dad's visiting, and he sees her doing everything on the phone, making dinner, doing the washing, making sure the kids are okay, while the husband sits on the lounge and watches TV. And he's watching this happen, and he writes her a letter, and it's like an apology because he never showed her that this half the load was his, and he goes home to his wife, and it's very emotional. Everyone cries when they watch this ad. He goes home and he says to his wife, no, I'll do the washing from his trip, and she has to show him how to put on the washing machine. But there's some great, amazing work being done by Unilever. P&G are doing some great work. And it's really encouraging.
I think actually now I have seen that ad and it is brilliant, and I think it shows the power that when, because advertising is amazing. When you get when you can tell those stories so powerfully, it does change attitudes. And I think that I thought that ad actually captured a lot of what we talk about, which is hard to put your finger on, which is, it's not just arguing about something for the sake of it. It's actually looking at how people's lives look. And I think what was depicted in that household is actually represented fairly well around the world. Okay, that's awesome.
This is a commercial break for Work It Out. We'll be back in a moment. But if you're interested in being a sponsor for Work It Out or Women's Agenda, just drop us a line and let us know. That's womensagenda.com.au.
So moving on then to, I suppose awesome is not the word that would jump to mind when I think of Fraser Anning, the senator.
No, I can think of some more fitting adjectives.
Yeah, not awesome. So he made his maiden speech in the Senate on Tuesday night, and it has been universally condemned, I would say. So he was briefly a member for One Nation, but is now actually a member of Bob Katter's party. He invoked some incredibly inflammatory language, and the sentiments that he sort of drew on in terms of basically saying that it's time to return to the White Australia policy. It's really dispiriting to actually even consider that this happened. We have had a lot of people come out and, from all sides of politics and beyond politics to condemn it. Tala, what is your take on our new senator?
Look, it's not favourable. No, I wrote a piece this morning about Fraser Manning, and I have to say that speech is just so dumbfounding in today. But I agree with you. I think it's really encouraging that we had so many people come out and just condemn it blatantly. If you on Twitter, it just went viral. And, all the senators and ministers kind of rallied behind, rallied together and really kind of quashed it quite quickly. And I think that's really good. The White Australia policy is a really sordid part of our history, and it's still quite young. We've only for the last half a century have we moved past it, but we've made really good inroads in that time. And I think, when you have people like this senator come up and spout just sheer bile, and incite this kind of hatred and potential violence, I think it's really damaging. But I like to think that Australia isn't a racist country. I think in my article today I spoke about how fringe kind of toxicity should never be accepted as the norm, or never be looked at as what's the norm in society, and I tend to feel that. I've come from a mixed heritage background. My mum and her family were immigrants. They moved to Cronulla in the 1970s, just after the White Australia policy had ended. My grandfather's Indian, my grandmother's Malaysian. They really embraced the culture of Australia, and they were embraced in return. And that's not to say that they haven't experienced racism in their lives, or my mum hasn't experienced racism in her life, or even I have. We have, but it is, I would not say that it's a typical occurrence, and I certainly don't think it is a silent majority as is what's commonly kind of described in Australia. I like to think that we are not there, and even though we have, idiots like this standing up in Parliament and saying these kind of, really, really damaging words, I don't think that we should start to fret about where we are and how beneficial multiculturalism is to country.
See, I think it's really interesting because, I mean, my comment on Fraser Anning's speech is that, and I'm not the first person to make this observation, but that it doesn't occur in a vacuum. I think that we have sort of seen with the rise of Pauline Hanson and with the various comments that have been made, I think at the moment about gangs in Melbourne, for example, I think there have been real attempts to use race as a potentially divisive
Definitely.
sort of tool.
Yeah.
And I think that when I would like to think that Australia is not a deeply racist country, but at the moment, when I see the experiences people are sharing of what they feel like as an Australian-born person of mixed cultural background, what they experience is actually incredibly isolating, and it is something they contend with on a regular basis. Kat, what do you sort of make of this? Do you think Australia is a racist country?
I think at times things like this happen, and I'm worried by the global trend towards, like, there seems to be growing anti-Semitism again in some parts of Germany, and I'm worried by the divisiveness that seems to be happening globally, and how polarizing opinions are.
Yeah.
I'd like to think that Australia is not a racist country, but when I listened to some of the comments from one of the Muslim members of Parliament, I've forgotten her name, Anna Lee, and she was getting quite emotional because comments like that have just made her think that there's been no progress in 30 years, and she's been experiencing the same problems, and the youth, the next generation, are experiencing the same problems. But at the same time, she did actually stand out and say thank you to every other member of Parliament who has, including Pauline Hanson, who has really distanced himself and said that is not the government's opinion, and we do not have institutionalised racism in government.
And I think, Tala, I do totally agree with you that we shouldn't mistake sort of this very loud minority as representing sort of mainstream Australia, because I think that's absolutely right. And I think
so much for a silent majority.
Exactly.
I wish.
But I think one of the things that I think is listening to someone like him do that speech in the culture that we're at, in the climate that we have at the moment, it's impossible to think he's not doing it to get attention.
Absolutely.
And he was guaranteed
Yeah.
to get headlines, and he has had headlines.
Yeah.
And I mean, I saw him, I didn't see him, but I heard him interviewed on 3AW, and the host Neil Mitchell was asking him about Australian-born Muslims, and he was saying that that they should be sent back to where they came from.
That's just ludicrous.
Well, they came from Australia, so we will send them back here. But I think, given the and it's a catch-22, because obviously you cannot let those sort of sentiments go, without having Parliament and members of Parliament standing up, as they have done, and sort of speak out against it. But at the same time, there is part of me that feels like we are just being played here, because this is how individuals like, for example, Donald Trump, when he was in his sort of the various election processes, campaigns to get to where he is now, the more controversial things he said, the more publicity he got and the more followers he got, because suddenly he was being given this platform. And I see that with him.
And I think this goes beyond free speech, right? And that's always the argument, is that everyone should be entitled to that, which I wholeheartedly agree with. But this is discriminatory speech. This is hate speech. And, it needs to be called out for that. And it is disappointing that people like this are able to actually represent the views of Australia.
Well, I think that's where I often come to, in terms of people who talk about free speech, which obviously is an important part in any democracy, but there's not equal speech. So we don't each get the opportunity to deliver a maiden speech in Parliament and have everyone in Australia effectively made aware of what we're thinking.
No.
And that's where I think it's problematic, because when someone like this has a platform, and they use it to sort of, and I mean, I think someone described it as sort of being unworthy of the Parliament, and I agree completely. And that's where it's really difficult to reconcile that.
And I think that's the problem that we've got in Australia in general, is that Parliament doesn't represent Australia as it is. It's not diverse, really. It is filled to the brim with like these toxic people that are just allowed free reign to spew bile, and that's a massive problem. I think we need to look at that, but I really, as much damage as they can do, and I understand that they've got this platform to kind of speak. I feel like we're missing real leadership in Parliament, and I think if we had that, we may not be contending with this issue. I think there have been times in Australia's history, much closer to the White Australia policy, and when it was actually, in existence, that Australia was far more progressive. I mean, Gough Whitlam was the Prime Minister straight after that policy, and certainly at that time we were a much more inclusive, progressive society, and that came from good leadership and strong condemnation of racism, and I think we can move back to that point as well. I think it's going to take a lot of work and a lot of good people in Parliament and strong views and strong leadership to get there, but I think we can get there.
Yeah, at the end of the day, it's just one man in Parliament. There's a lot more people with a louder voice. So sometimes maybe the media, we have to be careful that we don't blow it into a massive thing, and we try and give equal voice to those people that are saying the right things and are doing really good things in Parliament.
Yeah,
exactly.
And I do think we can say that what we've seen in the aftermath is a demonstration that there actually is some humanity and empathy and leadership in Parliament House, and perhaps if they could exercise it more readily, not just in response to so I think it's fair to say it's probably one of the most inflammatory Maid Inspectors ever delivered.
Possibly the most.
I think. I mean, Pauline Hanson in 1996
was hard to walk away from Pauline Hanson.
But I know you also have to think the day that Pauline Hanson is condemning you as being sort of saying appalling things is the day I would be stopping and thinking.
Just a bit of self-reflection now, mate.
But for something completely different, let's talk. This week on Women's Agenda, we published a piece by a woman, Dr. Nicole Archard, who is the principal of a girls' school in South Australia. And she sort of makes the case that, in her view, that sort of single-sex schools, all girls' schools, are particularly good at helping women to navigate and set themselves up to navigate the various barriers that women face. And so she sort of says that as a tool, the government should be considering all girls schools as an option to help counter gender inequality. And she makes the point, which is very valid, that as it stands, there are no single-sex schools for girls that aren't private. So effectively, if you can't afford thousands and thousands and thousands of dollars in school fees, you don't have that option for your children. Kat, what do you think? Do you think all girls schools are a good idea or a bad idea? What's your experience?
Look, I read this article and I tried to come at it with an open mind because I went to a mixed school, and I think often if you're happy with how you were educated, you will just assume that is the best way. So I came at this article with an assumption that why would you ever send your child to a single-sex school? So I try to be more open-minded and read the article for what it is. And, one of the main arguments I would have said, which she points out, this argument, is that throughout life, you're going to come up against and you're going to work with both females and males. And I don't know whether the schooling system really prepares you for negotiating some of those relationships if you're only in an environment with girls. That was my main concern. But I know that there are statistics around some females performing better in an all-female environment.
I think that there are statistics on both sides, really, and I think that's why it's a really hard thing to ever come at in a conclusive way. I also went to co-ed schools, but I feel like I'm a little bit conflicted on this one, because where I think that boys' schools or boy-only schools, and particularly very religious, very exclusive boys' schools, are quite damaging. I do think that there are things to pick out of girls' schools that and girls-only education, and I kind of accept idea that, you know, some girls do kind of flourish in that environment and you know, do learn better and feel less pressure and less embarrassment, and I can see how that can exist. I do think that I made the point earlier, but I think that if we are going to throw extra funding at government schools, then it should be for other things. I don't necessarily see this as a priority. I think government schools are lacking in so many ways in terms of, you know, just general resourcing. Obviously the teaching is fantastic and but there's just, you know, in my government school we had textbooks from 1984 and you know, the boys' private school next door had a white picket fence that they were putting up every, you know, redoing every 3 months. So I think that there are, you know, massive funding issues there, and I don't really think that this is where the money needs to be going, but I'm not as outraged as I thought I would be by this concept in general.
Yeah. One of my worries is that you grow up in a vacuum. If you grew up in a single-sex school, and not only that gender thing, but again, all of those single-sex schools tend to be private, tend to be well-educated, tend to be white majority. So I just think that going to a mixed school, going to a state school, you're exposed to so many different points of view, perspectives, that then kind of flows on to university degrees, into the workplace, and so then you have those diverse views. You're less likely to be biased and less likely to be discriminatory. So maybe the key to more equality in the workplace is having more, I would say, more mixed schools.
See, it's interesting. I think I have a couple of opposing views on this within my own mind. I'm a bit like you, Tala, in that I think that all male schools have been incredibly problematic for a lot of people. I don't think that on the whole, but I think that because of the nature of our schooling system, because the private schools, you know, the all-boys schools tend to be private, I think there's a whole raft of issues that we see come from that. So in that way, I sort of would say that I'm more for co-ed education. But then I went to an all-girls school, and I can't, as you said, Kat, I think what you experience, you sort of, it's hard to fault when you've had a positive experience. And when I look at the sort of all of the girls above and below me that I went through school with, I think that the school did a very, very good job of sort of pushing the fact that we could do whatever we wanted. And so in that way, I do think that there is power in a single-sex school for girls that goes beyond the curriculum. It's not about necessarily just, you know, teaching the course.
But then do you feel like at that point as well, having gone through that very empowering education, then coming out into the real world, is it not the biggest shock of your life?
Well, it is, and this is actually something that I talk about quite a lot, because I did throughout school think gender equality was pretty much sorted. I really did, and I speak to a lot of people about this now, and I'm not sure what is the best or worst case scenario, because when I was at school, obviously it was quite a while ago, and it was pre-social media, and it was certainly pre-Me Too. Obviously I didn't go to school last year. But there was no sort of broad narrative conversation, not even in the mainstream press. I mean, there was sort of probably on International Women's Day was the one time of the year that the newspapers might have covered gender inequality. So it just wasn't part of my sort of worldview. And then I got to uni, and again I was doing a course. It was actually slightly more girls than boys in the course I did. Started doing internships with law firms, and at the internship level of clerks there were more females than men. Then when I started working properly and was in a law firm the whole time, and I suddenly looked up and realised the numbers didn't stack up, that was when my awareness sort of really began to set in that actually gender inequality was a long way off. But I'm still torn on whether it was necessarily a negative thing to go through school without this sort of understanding or awareness of the barriers that women can face.
Yeah, and I accept that. I kind of think, though, that it's not necessarily the co-education that's the problem, because I think if there are certain issues that are occurring, and we can see that through girls going to school with boys, you can also counter that, right? I mean, one thing I read was that, you know, teachers tended to favour boys for maths programs and things like that. So, you know, these are issues that can be ironed out. And I think it's not necessarily the co-education. And really, we do need to, we need people to, you know, I strongly believe that people should be, you know, I guess introduced into a world that they're going to live in long term. And this is the reality. I mean, you don't live in a vacuum. You don't, you know, you are going to encounter and live with and work with men and all kinds of people from diverse backgrounds.
And I think that's sort of the final part to the various opposing views that I have, is that boys' schools are bad, girls' schools are good, but also that actually in reality I do think setting individuals up for the real world is probably useful, because part of the reason I think all boys' schools can create problems is because I think then when boys emerge and they are at university with females and then they're at workplaces that they're entitled, you know, well, I think there's definitely an element of that. And so I do actually come back to quite often thinking if you can create a school that reflects the world that they're going to sort of be part of afterwards, that's also quite a positive thing. So there you go. How 3 different views, one person.
No, that was great. I think we really solved that one, actually.
Yeah, really. Okay. Now we're going to wrap up now. Kat, we are going to, at the end of this podcast, we always ask for a recommendation. It can be anything, a good book that you've read, a podcast you're listening to.
You won't shut her up.
Oh, that's good. I always like recommendations.
She's got 400 podcasts on the go.
I love podcasts so much.
Okay.
I'm loving this one, actually. I've been listening to the last couple of episodes.
Thank you. We didn't even pay her to say that. Just on a side note there. What do you love?
So at the moment, I am loving this podcast called The Daily from the New York Times.
Oh, I have heard people say this.
It's like a political, it takes half an hour a day, talks about the key issues in America, and I'm just loving it. I'm obsessed with Trump at the moment, and I'm obsessed with what's going on there in immigration.
So it's
I just think it's so fascinating.
It's half an hour each day. Do you listen to it every day?
Almost every day.
Wow.
Yeah, she rocked up at my, full disclosure, so Kat is a good friend of mine, but she rocked up at my house the other day, and I got out and all I could hear was this drone of a podcast coming out of her car. I was like, look, you actually have to turn that off now. I just can't nerd it up with you right at this second. Like, we just have to call it quits.
We have to actually talk. Okay, so The Daily. Well, that sounds good. And Tala, what are you going to recommend today?
What have I been watching? I have just... Well, actually, I just watched the entire series, which is probably not something that I should freely admit to, but of Safe on Netflix.
Yeah.
Which I really enjoyed. It's so addictive. Yes. And also, I just like British crime shows better than American ones. There's just something about it.
Yeah, look, they do it well. And Angela actually recommended that one week. And after her recommendation, I went and binged it. It did take us 2 weeks. But
it made me feel a little bit gross about myself that I sat there for 5 hours.
Well, she
or whatever
did the same thing. She watched it all in one session, so it is quite a good one. My recommendation this week is I'm going to go old school to the actual television.
Stop it.
Does anyone watch that?
You know that thing? It's in the living room. But The Weekly with Charlie Pickering. But not just The Weekly with Charlie Pickering. Kitty Flanagan in The Weekly with Charlie Pickering, because I just think, hands down, she is one of the funniest people in Australia. And every single week, everything she says, I just cannot sort of breathe usually because I'm laughing so much, and I just think she's a legend. And I love the way they take on the news. So that'd be my recommendation for this week.
Although, so sad about the Tonightly finishing as well.
I know, it is.
I read a good tweet by Sam Dastiari actually, who said, are there no shows on the ABC now for young people?
I can't even say I'm young.
It feels a little bit like that.
Yeah, yep. That's disappointing, and I think that feedback is definitely, I've heard that across the board, because it was, it is a real shame. Which is a bit of a sad note to end on. But
sorry about that.
It is time.
After I said I wasn't going to be a Debbie Downer.
No. Tala. Kat, thank you so much for coming in today. And Tala, thanks for coming here.
Thanks, Georgie.
We will be back next week with Angela probably in the chair.
And just a shout out about Women's Agenda as well. We published daily, and we'll hit your mailbox with a newsletter at around 12 o'clock, give or take a little bit every day.
Yeah, it's the hit of news that every woman in Australia needs.
That's a wrap for Talk It Out, the Women's Agenda podcast, powered by Eagle Waves Radio. Don't forget to like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter, and jump on the website for more amazing shows. Catch you next time.